Chapter 15 of the Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward Ruppelt. Chapter 15. The Radiation Story. The idea for gathering together a group of scientists, to whom we referred to as our panel of experts, had been conceived early in 1952, as soon as serious talk about the possibility that the UFOs might be interplanetary spaceships had taken hold in both military and scientific circles. In fact, when Project Grudge was reorganized in the summer of 1951, the idea had been mentioned, and this was the main reason that our charter had said we were to be only a fact-finding group. The people on previous UFO projects had gone off on tangents of speculation about the identity of the UFOs. They first declared that they were spacecraft, then later, in a complete about-face, they took the whole UFO problem as one big belly laugh. Both approaches had gotten the Air Force into trouble. Why they did this, I don't know, because from the start we realized that no one at ATIC, in the Air Force, or in the whole military establishment was qualified to give a final yes or no answer to the UFO problem. Giving a final answer would require a serious decision, probably one of the most serious since the beginning of man. During 1952, many highly qualified engineers and scientists had visited Project Blue Book and had spent a day or two going over our reports. Some were very much impressed with the reports, some had all the answers. But all of the scientists who read our reports readily admitted that even though they may have thought that the reports did or did not indicate visitors from outer space, they would want to give the subject a good deal more study before they ever committed themselves in writing. Consequently, the people's opinions, although they were valuable, didn't give us enough to base a decision upon. We still needed a group to study our material thoroughly and give us written conclusions and recommendations which could be sent to the President if necessary. Our panel of experts was to consist of 6 or 8 of the top scientists in the United States. We fully realized that even the Air Force didn't have enough pull just to ask all of these people to drop the important work they were engaged in and spend a week or two studying our reports. Nor did we want to do it this way. We wanted to be sure that we had something worthwhile before asking for their valuable time. So, working through other government agencies, we organized a preliminary review panel of 4 people. All of them were competent scientists, and we knew their reputations were such that if they recommended that a certain top scientist sit on a panel to review our material, he would do it. In late November 1952, the preliminary review panel met at ATIC for 3 days. When the meeting ended, the group unanimously recommended that a higher court be formed to review the case of the UFO. In an hour, their recommendation was accepted by higher Air Force authorities, and the men proceeded to recommend the members for our proposed panel. They picked 6 men who had reputations as being both practical and theoretical scientists and who were known to have no biased opinions regarding the UFOs. The meeting of the panel, which would be held in Washington, was tentatively scheduled for late December or early January, depending upon when all of the scientists who had been asked to attend would be free. At Project Blue Book, activity went into high gear as we made preparations for the meeting. But before we were very far along, our preparations were temporarily sidetracked. I got a lead on the facts behind a rumor. Normally, we didn't pay attention to rumors, but this one was in a different class. Ever since the Air Force had become interested in UFO reports, the comment of those who had been requested to look them over and give a professional opinion was that we lacked the type of data you could get your teeth into. In even our best reports, we had to rely upon what someone had seen. I'd been told many times that if we had even one piece of information that was substantiated by some kind of recorded proof, a set of cinetheodolite movies of a UFO, a spectrum photograph, or any other kind of instrumented data that one could sit down and study, we would have no difficulty getting almost any scientist in the world interested in actively helping us find the answer to the UFO riddle. The rumor that caused me to temporarily halt our preparations for the high-level conference involved data that we might be able to get our teeth into. This is the way it went. In the fall of 1949, at some unspecified place in the United States, a group of scientists had set up equipment to measure background radiation, the small amount of harmless radiation that is always present in our atmosphere. This natural radiation varies to a certain degree, but will never increase by any appreciable amount unless there is a good reason. According to the rumor, two of the scientists at the unnamed place were watching the equipment one day when, for no apparent reason, a sudden increase of radiation was indicated. The radiation remained high for a few seconds, then dropped back to normal. The increase over normal was not sufficient to be dangerous, but it definitely was unusual. All indications pointed to equipment malfunction as the most probable explanation. A quick check revealed no obvious trouble with the gear, and the two scientists were about to start a more detailed check when a third member of the radiation crew came rushing into the lab. Before they could tell the newcomer about the unexplained radiation they had just picked up, he blurted out a story of his own. He had driven to a nearby town and, on his return trip, as he approached the research lab, something in the sky suddenly caught his eye. High in the cloudless blue he saw three silvery objects moving in a V formation. They appeared to be spherical in shape, but he wasn't sure. The first fact that hit him was that the objects were traveling too fast to be conventional aircraft. He jammed on the brakes, stopped his car, and shut off the engine. No sound. All he could hear was the quiet whir of a generator in the research lab. In a few seconds the objects had disappeared from sight. After the first two scientists had briefed their excited colleague on the unusual radiation they had detected, the three men asked each other the $64 question. Was there any connection between the two incidents? Had the UFOs caused the excessive radiation? They checked the time. Knowing almost exactly when the instruments had registered the increased radiation, they checked on how long it took to drive to the lab from the point where the three silver objects had been seen. The times correlated within a minute or two. The three men proceeded to check their radiation equipment thoroughly. Nothing was wrong. The rumor stopped here. Nothing that I or anyone else on Project Blue Book could find out shed any further light on the source of the story. People associated with the projects similar to the research lab that was mentioned in the rumor were sought out and questioned. Many of them had heard the story, but no one could add any new details. The three unknown scientists at the unnamed lab in an unknown part of the United States might as well never have existed. Maybe they hadn't. Almost a year after I had first heard the UFO radiation story, I got a long-distance call from a friend on the West Coast. I had seen him several months before, at which time I told him about this curious rumor and expressed my wish to find out how authentic it was. Now, on the phone, he told me he had just been in contact with two people he knew, and they had the whole story. He said they would be in Los Angeles the following night and would like very much to talk to me. I hated to fly clear to the West Coast on what might be a wild goose chase, but I did. I couldn't afford to run the risk of losing an opportunity to turn that old recurrent rumor into fact. 20 hours later, I met the two people at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel. We talked for several hours that night, and I got the details on the rumor and a lot more that I hadn't bargained for. Both of my informants were physicists working for the Atomic Energy Commission and were recognized in their fields. They wanted no publicity, and I promised them that they would get none. One of the men knew all the details behind the rumor and did most of the talking. To keep my promise of no publicity, I'll call him the scientist. The rumor version of the UFO radiation story that had been kicking around in Air Force and scientific circles for so long had been correct in detail, but it was by no means complete. The scientist said that after the initial sighting had taken place, word was spread at the research lab that the next time the instruments registered abnormal amounts of radiation, some of the personnel were to go outside immediately and look for some object in the sky. About 3 weeks after the first incident, a repetition did occur. While excessive radiation was registered on the instruments in the lab, a lone dark object was seen streaking across the sky. Again, the instruments were checked, but, as before, no malfunction was found. After this second sighting, according to the scientist, an investigation was started at the laboratory. The people who made the visual observation weren't sure that the object they had seen couldn't have been an airplane. Someone thought that perhaps some type of radar equipment in the airplane, if that's what the object was, might have affected the radiation detection equipment. So, arrangements were made to fly all types of aircraft over the area with their radar in operation. Nothing unusual happened. All possible types of airborne research equipment were traced during similar flights in the hope that some special equipment not normally carried in aircraft would be found to have caused the jump in radiation. But nothing out of the ordinary occurred during these tests either. It was tentatively concluded, the scientist continued, that the abnormally high radiation readings were officially due to some freakish equipment malfunction, and that the objects sighted visually were birds or airplanes. A report to this effect was made to military authorities, but since the conclusion stated that no flying saucers were involved, the report went into some unknown file. Project Blue Book never got it. Shortly after the second UFO radiation episode, the research group finished its work. It was at this time that the scientist had first become aware of the incidents he related to me. A friend of his, one of the men involved in the sightings, had sent the details in a letter. As the story of the sightings spread, it was widely discussed in scientific circles, with the result that the conclusion, an equipment malfunction, began to be more seriously questioned. Among the scientists who felt that further investigation of such phenomena was in order were the man to whom I was talking and some of the people who had made the original sightings. About a year later, the scientist and these original investigators were working together. They decided to make a few more tests on their own time, but with radiation detection equipment so designed that the possibility of malfunction would be almost nil. They formed a group of people who were interested in the project, and on evenings and weekends assembled and set up their equipment in an abandoned building on a small mountain peak. To ensure privacy and to avoid arousing undue interest among people not in on the project, the scientist and his colleagues told everyone that they had formed a mineral club. The mineral club deception covered their weekend expeditions because rockhounds are notorious for their addiction to scrambling around on mountains in search for specimens. The equipment that the group had installed in the abandoned building was designed to be self-operating. Geiger tubes were arranged in a pattern so that some idea as to the direction of the radiation source could be obtained. During the original sightings, the equipment malfunction factor could not be definitely established or refuted because certain critical data had not been measured. To get data on visual sightings, the Mineral Club had to rely on the flying saucer grapevine, which exists at every major scientific laboratory in the country. By late summer of 1950, they were in business. For the next 3 months, the scientist and his group kept their radiation equipment operating 24 hours a day, but the tapes showed nothing except the usual background activity. The saucer grapevine reported sightings in the general area of the tests, but none close to the instrumented mountaintop. The trip to the instrument shack, which had to be made every 2 days to change tapes, began to get tiresome for the rockhounds, and there was some talk of discontinuing the watch. But persistence paid off. Early in December, about 10 o'clock in the morning, the grapevine reported sightings of a silvery, circular-shaped object near the instrument shack. The UFO was seen by several people. When the rockhounds checked the recording tapes in the shack, they found that several of the Geiger tubes had been triggered at 10:17 a.m. The registered radiation increase was about 100 times greater than the normal background activity. 3 more times during the next 2 months, the Mineral Club's equipment recorded abnormal radiation on occasions when the grapevine reported visual sightings of UFOs. One of the visual sightings was substantiated by radar. After these incidents, the Mineral Club kept its instruments in operation until June 1951, but nothing more was recorded. And curiously enough, during this period while the radiation level remained normal, the visual sightings in the area dropped off too. The Mineral Club decided to concentrate on determining the significance of the data they had obtained. Accordingly, the scientist and the group made a detailed study of their mountaintop findings. They had friends working on many research projects throughout the United States and managed to visit and confer with them while on business trips. They investigated the possibility of unusual sunspot activity, but sunspots had been normal during the brief periods of high radiation. To clinch the elimination of sunspots as a cause, their record tapes showed no burst of radiation when sunspot activity had been abnormal. The rockhounds checked every possible research project that might have produced some stray radiation for their instruments to pick up. They found nothing. They checked and rechecked their instruments, but could find no factor that might have induced false readings. They let other scientists in on their findings, hoping that these outsiders might be able to put their fingers on errors that had been overlooked. Now, more than a year after the occurrence of the mysterious incidents that they had recorded, a year spent in analyzing their data, the rockhounds had no answer. By the best scientific tests that they had been able to apply, the visual sightings and the high radiation had taken place more or less simultaneously. Intriguing ideas are hard to kill, and this one had more than one life, possibly because of the element of mystery which surrounds the subject of flying saucers. But the scientific mind thrives on taking the mystery out of unexplained events, so it is not surprising that the investigation went on. According to my friend the scientist, a few people outside the laboratory where the rockhounds worked were told about the activities of the Mineral Club, and they started radiation detection groups of their own. For instance, 2 graduate astronomy students from a southwestern university started a similar watch, on a modest scale, using a modified standard Geiger counter as their detection unit. They did not build a recorder into their equipment, however, and consequently were forced to man their equipment continuously, which naturally cut down the time they were in operation. On 2 occasions they reportedly detected a burst of high radiation. Although the veracity of the 2 astronomers was not doubted, the scientist felt that the accuracy of their readings was poor because of the rather low quality of their equipment. The scientist then told me about a far more impressive effort to verify or disprove the findings of the Mineral Club. Word of the rockhounds and their work had also spread to a large laboratory in the East. An Air Force colonel, on duty at the lab, told the story to some of his friends, and they decided to look personally into the situation. Fortunately, these people were in a wonderful spot to make such an investigation. At their laboratory, an extensive survey of the surrounding area was being made. An elaborate system of radiation detection equipment had been set up for a radius of 100 miles around the lab. In addition, the defenses of the area included a radar net. Thanks to the flashing of silver eagles, the colonel's group got permission to check the records of the radiation survey station and to look over the logs of the radar stations. They found instances where, during the same period of time that radiation in the area had been much higher than normal, radar had had a UFO on the scope. These events had occurred during the period from January 1951 until about June 1951. Upon learning of the tentative but encouraging findings that the colonel's group had dug out of their past records, people on both the radiation survey crews and at the radar sites became interested in cooperating for further investigation. A tie-in with the local saucer grapevine established a 3-way check. One evening in July, just before sunset, 2 of the colonel's group were driving home from the laboratory. As they sped along the highway, they noticed 2 cars stopped ahead of them. The occupants were standing beside the road, looking at something in the sky. The 2 scientists stopped, got out of their car, and scanned the sky too. Low on the eastern horizon, they saw a bright circular object moving slowly north. They watched it for a while, took a few notes, then drove back to the lab. Some interesting news awaited them there. Radar had picked up an unidentified target near the spot where the scientists in the car had seen the UFO, and it had been traveling north. A fighter had been scrambled, but when it got into the proper area, the radar target was off the scope. The pilot glimpsed something that looked like the reported UFO, but before he could check further, he had to turn into the sun to get on an interception course, and he lost the object. Several days passed before the radiation reports from all stations could be collected. When the reports did come in, they showed that stations east of the laboratory, on an approximate line with the radar track, had shown the highest increase in radiation. Stations west of the lab showed nothing. The possible significance of this well-covered incident spurred the colonel's group to extend and refine their activities. Their idea was to build a radiation detection instrument in an empty wing tank and hang the tank on an F-47. Then when a UFO was reported, they would fly a search pattern in the area and try to establish whether or not a certain sector of the sky was more radioactive than other sectors. Also, they proposed to build a highly directional detector for the F-47 and attempt actually to track a UFO. The design of such equipment was started, but many delays occurred. Before the colonel's group could get any of the equipment built, some of the members left the lab for other jobs, and the colonel, who sparked the operation, was himself transferred elsewhere. The entire effort collapsed. The scientist was not surprised that I hadn't heard the story of the colonel's group. All the people involved, he said, had kept it quiet in order to avoid ridicule. The scientist added that he would be glad to give me all the data he had on the sightings of his mineral club, and he told me where to get the information about the two astronomers and the colonel's group. Armed with the scientist's notes and recorder tapes, I left for my office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton. With the blessings of my chief, I started to run down the rest of the radiation information. The data we had, especially that from the scientist's mineral club, had been thoroughly analyzed, but we thought that since we now had access to more general data, something new and more significant might be found. First, I contacted the government agency for which all of the people involved in these investigations had been working, the scientists who recorded the original incident, the scientist and his mineral club, the colonel's group, and the rest. The people in the agency were very cooperative, but stressed the fact that the activities I was investigating were strictly the extracurricular affairs of the scientists involved, had no official sanction, and should not be tied in with the agency in any way, shape, or form. This closed-door reaction was typical of how the words "flying saucer" seemed to scare some people. They did help me locate the report on the original incident, however, and since it seemed to be the only existing copy, I arranged to borrow it. About this same time we located the two graduate astronomy students in New Mexico. Both now had their PhDs and held responsible jobs on highly classified projects. They repeated their story, which I had first heard from the scientist, but had kept no record of their activities. On one occasion, just before dawn on a Sunday morning, they were on the roof, making some meteorological observations. One of them was listening to the Geiger counter when he detected a definite increase in the clicking. Just as the frequency of the clicks reached its highest peak, almost a steady buzz, a large fireball, described by them as spectacular, flashed across the sky. Both of the observers had seen several of the green fireballs and said that this object was similar in all respects except that the color was a brilliant blue-white. With the disappearance of the fireball, the counter once more settled down to a steady click per second. They added that once before they had detected a similar increase in the frequency of the clicks, but had seen nothing in the sky. In telling their story, both astronomers stressed the point that their data were open to a great deal of criticism, mainly because of the limited instrumentation they had used. We agreed. Still, their work tended to support the findings of the more elaborate and systematic radiation investigations. The gods who watch over the UFO project were smiling about this time, because one morning I got a call from a colonel on Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He was going to be in our area that morning, and planned to stop in to see me. He arrived in a few minutes, and turned out to be none other than the colonel who had headed the group which had investigated UFOs and radiation at the Eastern Laboratory. He repeated his story. It was the same as I had heard from the scientist, with a few insignificant changes. The colonel had no records of his group's operations, but knew who had them. He promised to get a wire off to the person immediately, which he did. The answer was a bit disappointing. During the intervening months, the data had been scattered out among the members of the colonel's group, and when the group broke up, so did its collection of records. So all we had to fall back on was the colonel's word, but since he now was heading a top priority project at Wright, it would be difficult not to believe him. After obtaining the colonel's story, we collected all available data concerning known incidents in which there seemed to be a correlation between the visual sighting of UFOs and the presence of excess atomic radiation in the area of the sightings. There was one last thing to do. I wanted to take the dates and times of all the reported radiation increases and check them against all sources of UFO reports. This project would take a lot of legwork and digging, but I felt that it would offer the most positive and complete evidence we could assemble as to whether or not a correlation existed. Accordingly, we dug into our files, ADC radar logs, press wire service files, newspaper morgues in the sighting area, and the files of individuals who collect data on saucers. Whenever we found a visual report that correlated with a radiation peak, we checked it against weather conditions, balloon tracks, astronomical reports, etc. As soon as the data had all been assembled, I arranged for a group of Air Force consultants to look it over. I got the same old answer. The data still aren't good enough. The men were very much interested in the reports, but when it came time to putting their comments on paper, they said, "Not enough conclusive evidence." If in some ways the UFOs could have been photographed at the same time that the radiation detectors were going wild, it would have been a different story, they later told me. But with the data I had for them, this was the only answer they could give. No one could explain the sudden bursts of radiation, but there was no proof that they were associated with UFOs. The board's ruling wrote finish to this investigation. I informed the colonel, and he didn't like the decision. Later I passed through the city where the scientist was working. I stopped over a few hours to brief him on the board's decision. He shook his head in disbelief. It is interesting to note that both the colonel and the scientist reacted in the same way. We're not fools. We were there. We saw it. They didn't. What do they want for proof? End of chapter 15. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 16 of The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward Ruppelt. Chapter 16. The Hierarchy Ponders. By early January 1953, the scientists who were to be members of our panel of experts had been contacted and had agreed to sit in judgment of the UFO. In turn, we agreed to give them every detail about the UFO. We had our best reports for them to read, and we were going to show them the two movies that some intelligence officers considered as the positive proof, the Tremonton movie and the Montana movie. When this high court convened on the morning of January 12th, the first thing it received was its orders. One of 3 verdicts would be acceptable. All UFO reports are explainable as known objects or natural phenomena, therefore the investigation should be permanently discontinued. The UFO reports do not contain enough data upon which to base a final conclusion. Project Blue Book should be continued in hopes of obtaining better data. The UFOs are interplanetary spacecraft. The written verdict, the group was told, would be given to the National Security Council, a council made up of the directors of all U.S. intelligence agencies, and thence it would go to the President of the United States, if they should decide that the UFOs were interplanetary spacecraft. Because of military regulations, the names of the panel members, like the names of so many other people associated with the UFO story, cannot be revealed. 2 of the men had made names for themselves as practical physicists. They could transform the highest theory for practical uses. One of these men had developed the radar that pulled us out of a big hole at the beginning of World War II, and the other had been one of the fathers of the H-bomb. Another of the panel members is now the chief civilian advisor to one of our top military commanders, and another was an astronomer whose unpublished fight to get the UFO recognized is respected throughout scientific circles. There was a man who is noted for his highly theoretical physics and mathematics, and another who had pioneered operations research during World War II. The 6th member of the panel had been honored by the American Rocket Society and the International Aeronautical Federation for his work in moving space travel from the Buck Rogers realm to the point of near reality, and who is now a rocket expert. It was an impressive collection of top scientific talent. During the first 2 days of the meeting, I reviewed our findings for the scientists. Since June 1947, when the first UFO report had been made, ATIC had analyzed 1,593 UFO reports. About 4,400 had actually been received, but all except 1,593 had been immediately rejected for analysis. From our studies, we estimated that ATIC received reports of only 10% of the UFO sightings that were made in the United States. Therefore, in 5.5 years, something like 44,000 UFO sightings had been made. Of the 1,593 reports that had been analyzed by Project Blue Book, and we had studied and evaluated every report in the Air Force files, we had been able to explain a great many. The actual breakdown was like this: balloons, 18.51%; known, 1.57; probable, 4.99; possible, 11.95, 18.51. Aircraft, 11.76%; known, 0.98; probable, 7.74; possible, 3.04, 11.76. Astronomical bodies, 14.20%; known, 2.79; probable, 4.01; possible, 7.40, 14.20. Other, 4.21%. Searchlights on clouds, birds, blowing paper, inversions, reflections, etc. Hoaxes, 1.66%. Insufficient data, 22.72%, in addition to those initially eliminated. Unknowns, 26.94%. By using the terms known, probable, and possible, we were able to differentiate how positive we were of our conclusions. But even in the possible cases we were, in our own minds, sure that we had identified the reported UFO. And who made these reports? Pilots and air crews made 17.1% from the air. Scientists and engineers made 5.7%. Airport control tower operators made an even 1.0% of the reports. And 12.5% of the total were radar reports. The remaining 63.7% were made by military and civilian observers in general. The reports that we were interested in were the 26.94%, or 429 unknowns, so we had studied them in great detail. We studied the reported colors of the UFOs, the shapes, the directions they were traveling, the times of day they were observed, and many more details, but we could find no significant pattern or trends. We did find that the most often reported shape was elliptical, and that the most often reported color was white or metallic. About the same number of UFOs were reported as being seen in daytime as at night, and the direction of travel equally covered the 16 cardinal headings of the compass. 70% of the unknowns had been seen visually from the air. 12% had been seen visually from the ground. 10% had been picked up by ground or airborne radar, and 8% were combination visual radar sightings. In the overall total of 1,593 sightings, women made 2 reports for every 1 made by a man, but in the unknowns the men beat out women 10 to 1. There were 2 other factors we could never resolve: the frequency of the sightings and their geographical distribution. Since the first flurry of reports in July of 1947, each July brought a definite peak in reports. Then a definite secondary peak occurred just before each Christmas. We plotted these peaks in sightings against high tides, worldwide atomic tests, the positions of the moon and planets, the general cloudiness over the United States, and a dozen and one other things. But we could never say what caused more people to see UFOs at certain times of the year. Then the UFOs were habitually reported from areas around technically interesting places, like our atomic energy installations, harbors, and critical manufacturing areas. Our studies showed that such vital military areas as Strategic Air Command and Air Defense Command bases, some A-bomb storage areas, and large military depots actually produced fewer reports than could be expected from a given area in the United States. Large population centers devoid of any major technically interesting facilities also produced few reports. According to the laws of normal distribution, if UFOs are not intelligently controlled vehicles, the distribution of reports should have been similar to the distribution of population in the United States. It wasn't. Our study of the geographical locations of sightings also covered other countries. The U.S. by no means had a curb on the UFO market. In all of our unknown reports, we never found one measurement of size, speed, or altitude that could be considered to be even fairly accurate. We could say only that some of the UFOs had been traveling pretty fast. As far as radar was concerned, we had reports of fantastic speeds, up to 50,000 miles an hour, but in all of these instances there was some doubt as to exactly what caused the target. The highest speeds reported for our combination radar visual sightings, which we considered to be the best type of sighting in our files, were 700 to 800 miles an hour. We had never picked up any hardware, any whole saucers, pieces, or parts that couldn't be readily identified as being something very earthly. We had a contract with a materials testing laboratory, and they would analyze any piece of material that we found or was sent to us. The tar-covered marble, aluminum broom handle, cow manure, slag, pieces of plastic balloon, and the what have you that we did receive and analyze only served to give the people in our material lab some practice and added nothing but laughs to the UFO project. The same went for the reports of contacts with spacemen. Since 1952, a dozen or so people have claimed that they have talked to or ridden with the crews of flying saucers. They offer affidavits, pieces of material, photographs, and other bits and pieces of junk as proof. We investigated some of these reports and could find absolutely no fact behind the stories. We had 100 or so photos of flying saucers, both stills and movies. Many were fakes, some so expert that it took careful study by photo interpreters to show how the photos had been faked. Some were the crudest of fakes, automobile hubcaps thrown into the air, homemade saucers suspended by threads, and just plain retouched negatives. The rest of the still photos had been sent in by well-meaning citizens who couldn't recognize a light flare of flaw in the negative, or who had chanced to get an excellent photo of a sundog or mirage. But the movies that were sent in to us were different. In the first place, it takes an expert with elaborate equipment to fake a movie. We had or knew about 4 strips of movie film that fell into the unknown category. 2 were the cinetheodolite movies that had been taken at White Sands Proving Ground in April and May of 1950. 1 was the Montana movie, and the last was the Tremonton movie. These latter 2 had been subjected to thousands of hours of analysis, and since we planned to give the panel of scientists more thorough reports on them on Friday, I skipped over their details and went to the next point I wanted to cover: theories. Periodically throughout the history of the UFO, people have come up with widely publicized theories to explain all UFO reports. The one that received the most publicity was the one offered by Dr. Donald Menzel of Harvard University. Dr. Menzel, writing in Time, Look, and later in his Flying Saucers, claimed that all UFO reports could be explained as various types of light phenomena. We studied this theory thoroughly because it did seem to have merit. Project Bear's physicists studied it. ATI's scientific consultant studied it and discussed it with several leading European physicists whose specialty was atmospheric physics. In general, the comments that Project Blue Book received were, "He's given the subject some thought, but his explanations are not the panacea." And there were other widely publicized theories. One man said that they were all skyhook balloons, but we knew the flight path of every skyhook balloon, and they were seldom reported as UFOs. Their little brothers, the weather balloons, caused us a great deal more trouble. The Army engineers took a crack at solving the UFO problem by making an announcement that a scientist in one of their laboratories had duplicated a flying saucer in his laboratory. Major Dewey Fournet checked into this one. It had all started out as a joke, but it was picked up as fact, and the scientist was stuck with it. He gained some publicity, but lost prestige, because other scientists wondered just how competent the man really was to try to pass off such an answer. All in all, the unsolicited assistance of theorists didn't help us a bit, I told the panel members. Some of them were evidently familiar with the theories because they nodded their heads in agreement. The next topic I covered in my briefing was a question that came up quite frequently in discussions of the UFO. Did UFO reports actually start in 1947? We had spent a great deal of time trying to resolve this question. Old newspaper files, journals, and books that we found in the Library of Congress contained many reports of odd things being seen in the sky as far back as the biblical times. The old Negro spiritual says, "Ezekiel saw a wheel way up in the middle of the air." We couldn't substantiate Ezekiel's sighting because many of the very old reports of odd things observed in the sky could be explained as natural phenomena that weren't fully understood in those days. The first documented reports of sightings similar to the UFO sightings as we know them today appeared in the newspapers of 1896. In fact, the series of sightings that occurred in that year and the next had many points of similarity with the reports of today. The sightings started in the San Francisco Bay Area on the evening of November 22, 1896, when hundreds of people going home from work saw a large, dark, cigar-shaped object with stubby wings traveling northwest across Oakland. Within hours after the mystery craft had disappeared over what is now the northern end of the Golden Gate Bridge, the stories of people in other Northern California towns began to come in on the telegraph wires. The citizens of Santa Rosa, Sacramento, Chico, and Red Bluff, several thousand of them, saw it. I tried to find out if the people in these outlying communities saw the UFO before they heard the news from the San Francisco area or afterward, but trying to run down the details of a 56-year-old UFO report is almost hopeless. Once, while I was on a trip to Hamilton Air Force Base, I called the offices of the San Francisco Chronicle, and they put me in touch with a retired employee who had worked on a San Francisco paper in 1896. I called the old gentleman on the phone and talked to him for a long time. He had been a copy boy at the time and remembered the incident, but time had canceled out the details. He did tell me that he, the editor of the paper, and the news staff had seen the ship, as he referred to the UFO. His story, even though it was 56 years old, smacked of others I'd heard when he said that no one at the newspaper ever told anyone what they had seen. They didn't want people to think that they were crazy. On November 30th, the mystery ship was back over the San Francisco area, and those people who had maintained that people were being fooled by a wag in a balloon became believers when the object was seen moving into the wind. For 4 months, reports came in from villages, cities, and farms in the West, then the Midwest, as the airship moved eastward. In early April of 1897, people in Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois reported seeing it. On April 10th, it was reported to be over Chicago. Reports continued to come into the newspapers until about April 20th. Then it, or stories about it, were gone. Literally thousands of people had seen it before the last report clicked in over the telegraph wires. A study of the hundreds of newspaper accounts of this sighting that rocked the world in the late 1890s was interesting because the same controversies that arose then exist now. Those who hadn't seen this stubby-winged, cigar-shaped craft said "phooey," or the 19th century version thereof. Those who had seen it were almost ready to do battle to uphold their integrity. Some astronomers loudly yelled "Venus," "Jupiter," and "Alpha Orionis," while others said, "We saw it." Thomas Edison, the man of science of the day, disclaimed any knowledge of the mystery craft. "I prefer to devote my time to objects of commercial value," he told a New York Herald reporter. "At best, airships would only be toys." Thomas, you goofed on that prediction. I had one more important point to cover before I finished my briefing and opened the meeting to a general question and answer session. During the past year and a half, we had had several astronomers visit Project Blue Book, and they were not at all hesitant to give us their opinions, but they didn't care to say much about what their colleagues were thinking, although they did indicate that they were thinking. We decided that the opinions and comments of astronomers would be of value, so late in 1952 we took a poll. We asked an astronomer who we knew to be unbiased about the UFO problem and who knew every outstanding astronomer in the United States to take a trip and talk to his friends. We asked him not to make a point of asking about the UFO, but just to work the subject into a friendly conversation. This way we hoped to get a completely frank opinion. To protect his fellow astronomers, our astronomer gave them all code names and he kept the key to the code. The report we received expressed the detailed opinions of 45 recognized authorities. Their opinions varied from that of Dr. C, who regarded the UFO project as a silly waste of money to investigate an even sillier subject, to Dr. L, who has spent a great deal of his own valuable time personally investigating UFO reports because he believes that they are something real. Of the 45 astronomers who were interviewed, 36% were not at all interested in the UFO reports. 41% were interested to the point of offering their services if they were ever needed, and 23% thought that the UFOs were a much more serious problem than most people recognized. None of the astronomers, even during a friendly discussion, admitted that he thought the UFOs could be interplanetary vehicles. All of those who were interested would only go so far as to say, "We don't know what they are, but they're something real." During the past few years, I have heard it said that if the UFOs were really solid objects, our astronomers would have seen them. Our study shed some light on this point. Astronomers have seen UFOs. None of them has ever seen or photographed anything resembling a UFO through his telescope, but 11% of the 45 men had seen something that they couldn't explain. Although, technically speaking, these sightings were no better than hundreds of others in our files as far as details were concerned, they were good because of the caliber of the observer. Astronomers know what is in the sky. It is interesting to note that out of the representative cross-section of astronomers, 5 of them, or 11%, had sighted UFOs. For a given group of people, this is well above average. To check this point, the astronomer who was making our study picked 90 people at random, people he met while traveling, and got them into a conversation about flying saucers. These people were his control group, to borrow a term from the psychologists. Although the percentage of people who were interested in UFOs was higher for the control group than for the group of astronomers, only 41% of the astronomers were interested, while 86% of the control group were interested. 11% of the astronomers had seen UFOs, while only about 1% of the control group had seen one. This seemed to indicate that as a group, astronomers see many more UFOs than the average citizen. When I finished my briefing, it was too late to start the question and answer session, so the first day's meeting adjourned. But promptly at 9 o'clock the next morning, the group was again gathered, and from the looks of the list of questions some of them had, they must have been thinking about UFOs all night. One of the first questions was about the results of photography taken by the pairs of huge meteorite patrol cameras that are located in several places throughout North America. Did they ever photograph a UFO? The cameras, which are in operation almost every clear night, can photograph very dim lights, and once a light is photographed, its speed and altitude can be very accurately established. If there were any objects giving off light as they flew through our atmosphere, there is a chance that these cameras might have photographed them. But they hadn't. At first, this seemed to be an important piece of evidence, and we had just about racked this fact up as a definite score against the UFO when we did a little checking. If the UFO had been flying at an altitude of 100 miles, the chances of it being picked up by the cameras would be good, but the chances of photographing something flying any lower would be less. This may account for the fact that while our inquiring astronomer was at the meteorite patrol camera sites, he talked to an astronomer who had seen a UFO while operating one of the patrol cameras. Many people have asked why our astronomers haven't seen anything through their big telescopes. They are focused light years away, and their field of vision is so narrow that even if UFOs did exist and littered the atmosphere, they wouldn't be seen. Another question the panel had was about Orson Welles' famous War of the Worlds broadcast of October 1938, which caused thousands of people to panic. Had we studied this to see if there were any similarities between it and the current UFO reporting? We had. Our psychologist looked into the matter and gave us an opinion. To make a complete study and get a positive answer would require an effort that would dwarf the entire UFO project. But he did have a few comments. There were many documented cases in which a series of innocent circumstances triggered by the broadcast had caused people to completely lose all sense of good judgment, to panic. There were some similar reports in our UFO files. But we had many reports in which people reported UFOs and obviously hadn't panicked. Reports from pilots who had seen mysterious lights at night and, thinking that they might be a cockpit reflection, had turned off all their cockpit lights. Or the pilots who turned and rolled their airplanes to see if they could change the angle of reflection and get rid of the UFO. Or those pilots who climbed and dove thousands of feet and then leveled out to see if the UFO would change its relative position to the airplane. Or the amateur astronomer who made an excellent sighting and before he reluctantly reported it as a UFO, had talked to a half-dozen professional astronomers and physicists in hopes of finding an explanation. All of these people were thinking clearly, questioning themselves as to what the sightings could be, then trying to answer their questions. These people weren't panicked. The question and answer period went on for a full day as the scientists dug into the details of the general facts I had given them in my briefing. The following day and a half was devoted to reviewing and discussing 50 of our best sighting reports that we had classed as unknowns. The next item on the agenda, when the panel had finished absorbing all of the details of the 50 selected top reports, was a review of a very hot and very highly controversial study. It was based on the idea that Major Dewey Fournet and I had talked about several months before, an analysis of the motions of the reported UFOs in an attempt to determine whether they were intelligently controlled. The study was hot because it wasn't official, and the reason it wasn't official was because it was so hot. It concluded that the UFOs were interplanetary spaceships. The report had circulated around high command levels of intelligence and it had been read with a good deal of interest. But even though some officers at command levels just a notch below General Samford bought it, the space behind the words "Approved by" was blank. No one would stick his neck out and officially send it to the top. Dewey Fournet, who had completed his tour of active duty in the Air Force and was now a civilian, was called from Houston, Texas, to tell the scientists about the study since he had worked very closely with the group that had prepared it. The study covered several hundred of our most detailed UFO reports. By a very critical process of elimination, based on the motion of the reported UFOs, Fournet told the panel how he and any previous analysis by Project Blue Book had been disregarded, and how those reports that could have been caused by any one of the many dozen known objects, balloons, airplanes, astronomical bodies, etc., were sifted out. This sifting took quite a toll, and the study ended up with only 10 or 20 reports that fell into the unknown category. Since such critical methods of evaluation had been used, these few reports proved beyond a doubt that the UFOs were intelligently controlled by persons with brains equal to or far surpassing ours. The next step in the study, Fournet explained, was to find out where they came from. Earthlings were eliminated, leaving the final answer: spacemen. Both Dewey and I had been somewhat worried about how the panel would react to a study with such definite conclusions. But when he finished his presentation, it was obvious from the tone of the questioning that the men were giving the conclusions serious thought. Fournet's excellent reputation was well known. On Friday morning we presented the feature attractions of the session: the Tremonton movie and the Montana movie. These two bits of evidence represented the best photos of UFOs that Project Blue Book had to offer. The scientists knew about them, especially the Tremonton movie, because since late July they had been the subject of many closed-door conferences. Generals, admirals, and GS-16s had seen them at command performances, and they had been flown to Kelly Air Force Base in Texas to be shown to a conference of intelligence officers from all over the world. Two of the country's best military photo laboratories, the Air Force Lab at Wright Field and the Navy's lab at Anacostia, Maryland, had spent many hours trying to prove that the UFOs were balloons, airplanes, or stray light reflections, but they failed. The UFOs were true unknowns. The possibility that the movie had been faked was considered, but quickly rejected, because only a Hollywood studio with elaborate equipment could do such a job, and the people who filmed the movies didn't have this kind of equipment. The Montana movie had been taken on August 15, 1950, by Nick Mariana, the manager of the Great Falls baseball team. It showed two large bright lights flying across the blue sky in an echelon formation. There were no clouds in the movie to give an indication of the UFO's speed, but at one time they passed behind a water tower. The lights didn't show any detail; they appeared to be large, circular objects. Mariana had sent his movies to the Air Force back in 1950, but in 1950 there was no interest in the UFO, so, after a quick viewing, Project Grudge had written them off as the reflections from two F-94 jet fighters that were in the area. In 1952, at the request of the Pentagon, I reopened the investigation of the Montana movie. Working through an intelligence officer at the Great Falls Air Force Base, I had Mariana re-interrogated and obtained a copy of his movie, which I sent to the photo lab. When the photo lab got the movie, they had a little something to work with because the two UFOs had passed behind a reference point, the water tower. Their calculations quickly confirmed that the objects were not birds, balloons, or meteors. Balloons drift with the wind, and the wind was not blowing in the direction that the two UFOs were traveling. No exact speeds could be measured, but the lab could determine that the lights were traveling too fast to be birds and too slow to be meteors. This left airplanes as the only answer. The intelligence officer at Great Falls had dug through huge stacks of files and found that only 2 airplanes, 2 F-94s, were near the city during the sighting, and that they had landed about 2 minutes afterwards. Both Mariana and his secretary, who had also seen the UFOs, had said that the 2 jets had appeared in another part of the sky only a minute or 2 after the 2 UFOs had disappeared in the southeast. This in itself would eliminate the jets as candidates for the UFOs, but we wanted to double check. The 2 circular lights didn't look like F-94s, but anyone who has done any flying can tell you that an airplane so far away that it can't be seen can suddenly catch the sun's rays and make a brilliant flash. First, we studied the flight paths of the 2 F-94s. We knew the landing pattern that was being used on the day of the sighting, and we knew when the 2 F-94s landed. The 2 jets just weren't anywhere close to where the 2 UFOs had been. Next, we studied each individual light, and both appeared to be too steady to be reflections. We drew a blank on the Montana movie. It was an unknown. We also drew a blank on the Tremonton movie, a movie that had been taken by Navy Chief Photographer Warrant Officer Delbert C. Newhouse on July 2, 1952. Our report on the incident showed that Newhouse, his wife, and their 2 children were driving to Oakland, California, from the East Coast on this eventful day. They had just passed through Tremonton, Utah, a town north of Salt Lake City, and had traveled about 7 miles on US Highway 30S when Mrs. Newhouse noticed a group of objects in the sky. She pointed them out to her husband. He looked, pulled over to the side of the road, stopped the car, and jumped out to get a better look. He didn't have to look very long to realize that something highly unusual was taking place, because in his 21 years in the Navy and 2,000 hours flying time as an aerial photographer, he'd never seen anything like this. About a dozen shiny disc-like objects were milling around the sky in a rough formation. Newhouse had his movie camera, so he turned the turret around to a 3-inch telephoto lens and started to photograph the UFOs. He held the camera still and took several feet of film, getting all of the bright objects in one photo. All of the UFOs had stayed in a compact group from the time the Newhouse family had first seen them, but just before they disappeared over the western horizon, one of them left the main group and headed east. Newhouse swung his camera around and took several shots of it, holding his camera steady and letting the UFO pass through the field of view before it disappeared in the east. When I received the Tremonton films, I took them right over to the Wright Field Photo Lab, along with the Montana movie, and the photo technicians and I ran them 20 or 30 times. The 2 movies were similar in that in both of them the objects appeared to be large circular lights. In neither one could you see any detail. But unlike the Montana movie, the lights in the Tremonton movie would fade out, then come back in again. This fading immediately suggested airplanes reflecting light, but the roar of a king-sized dogfight could have been heard for miles, and the Newhouse family had heard no sound. We called in several fighter pilots, and they watched the UFOs circling and darting in and out of the cloudless blue sky. Their unqualified comment was that no airplane could do what the UFOs were doing. Balloons came under suspicion, but the lab eliminated them just as quickly by studying the kind of a reflection given off by a balloon. It is a steady reflection, since a balloon is spherical. Then, to further scuttle the balloon theory, clusters of balloons are tied together and don't mill around. Of course, the lone UFO that took off to the east by itself was the biggest argument against balloons. Newhouse told an intelligence officer from the Western Air Defense Forces that he had held his camera still and let this single UFO fly through the field of view so the people in the lab measured its angular velocity. Unfortunately, there were no clouds in the sky, nor was he able to include any of the ground in the pictures, so our estimates of angular velocity had to be made assuming that the photographer held his camera still. Had the lone UFO been 10 miles away, it would have been traveling several thousand miles an hour. After studying the movies for several weeks, the Air Force Photo Lab at Wright Field gave up. All they had to say was, "We don't know what they are, but they aren't airplanes or balloons, and we don't think they are birds." While the lab had been working on the movies at Wright Field, Major Fournet had been talking to the Navy photo people at Anacostia. They thought they had some good ideas on how to analyze the movies, so as soon as we were through with them, I sent them to Major Fournet and he took them over to the Navy lab. The Navy lab spent about 2 months studying the films and had just completed their analysis. The men who had done the work were on hand to brief the panel of scientists on their analysis after the panel had seen the movies. We darkened the room and I would imagine that we ran each film 10 times before every panel member was satisfied that he had seen and could remember all of the details. We ran both films together so that the men could compare them. The Navy analysts didn't use the words interplanetary spacecraft when they told of their conclusions, but they did say that the UFOs were intelligently controlled vehicles and that they weren't airplanes or birds. They had arrived at this conclusion by making a frame-by-frame study of the motion of the lights and the changes in the light's intensity. When the Navy people had finished with their presentation, the scientists had questions. None of the panel members were trying to find fault with the work the Navy people had done, but they weren't going to accept the study until they had meticulously searched for every loophole. Then they found one. In measuring the brilliance of the lights, the photoanalysts had used an instrument called a densitometer. The astronomer on the panel knew all about measuring the density of an extremely small photographic image with a densitometer because he did it all the time in his studies of the stars. And the astronomer didn't think that the Navy analysts had used the correct technique in making their measurements. This didn't necessarily mean that their data were all wrong, but it did mean that they should recheck their work. When the discussion of the Navy's report ended, one of the scientists asked to see the Tremonton movie again, so I had the projectionist run it several more times. The man said that he thought the UFOs could be seagulls soaring on a thermal current. He lived in Berkeley and said that he'd seen gulls high in the air over San Francisco Bay. We had thought of this possibility several months before, because the area around the Great Salt Lake is inhabited by large white gulls. But the speed of the lone UFO as it left the main group had eliminated the gulls. I pointed this out to the physicist. His answer was that the Navy warrant officer might have thought he had held the camera steady, but he could have panned with the action unconsciously. This would throw all of our computations way off. I agreed with this, but I couldn't agree that they were seagulls. But several months later I was in San Francisco waiting for an airliner to Los Angeles, and I watched gulls soaring in a cloudless sky. They were riding a thermal, and they were so high that you couldn't see them until they banked just a certain way. Then they appeared to be a bright white flash, much larger than one would expect from seagulls. There was a strong resemblance to the UFOs in the Tremonton movie. But I'm not sure that this is the answer. The presentation of the two movies ended Project Blue Book's part of the meeting. In 5 days we had given the panel of scientists every pertinent detail in the history of the UFO, and it was up to them to tell us if they were real, some type of vehicle flying through our atmosphere. If they were real, then they would have to be spacecraft, because no one at the meeting gave a second thought to the possibility that the UFOs might be a super-secret US aircraft or a Soviet development. The scientists knew everything that was going on in the US, and they knew that no country in the world had developed their technology far enough to build a craft that would perform as the UFOs were reported to do. In addition, we were spending billions of dollars on the research and development and the procurement of airplanes that were just nudging the speed of sound. It would be absurd to think that these billions were being spent to cover the existence of a UFO-type weapon. And it would be equally absurd to think that the British, French, Russians, or any other country could be far enough ahead of us to have a UFO. The scientists spent the next 2 days pondering a conclusion. They reread reports and looked at the two movies again and again. They called other scientists to double-check certain ideas that they had, and they discussed the problem among themselves. Then they wrote out their conclusions, and each man signed the document. The first paragraph said, "We as a group do not believe that it is impossible for some other celestial body to be inhabited by intelligent creatures. Nor is it impossible that these creatures could have reached such a state of development that they could visit the earth. However, there is nothing in all of the so-called flying saucer reports that we have read that would indicate that this is taking place." The Tremonton movie had been rejected as proof, but the panel did leave the door open a crack when they suggested that the Navy Photo Lab redo their study. But the Navy lab never rechecked their report, and it was over a year later before new data came to light. After I got out of the Air Force, I met Newhouse and talked to him for 2 hours. I've talked to many people who have reported UFOs, but few impressed me as much as Newhouse. I learned that when he and his family first saw the UFOs, they were close to the car, much closer than when he took the movie. To use Newhouse's own words, "If they had been the size of a B-29, they would have been at 10,000 feet altitude." And the Navy man and his family had taken a good look at the objects. They looked like two pie pans, one inverted on the top of the other. He didn't just think the UFOs were disc-shaped, he knew that they were. He had plainly seen them. I asked him why he hadn't told this to the intelligence officer who interrogated him. He said that he had. Then I remembered that I'd sent the intelligence officer a list of questions I wanted Newhouse to answer. The question, "What did the UFOs look like?" wasn't one of them, because when you have a picture of something, you don't normally ask what it looks like. Why the intelligence officer didn't pass this information on to us, I'll never know. The Montana movie was rejected by the panel as positive proof because even though the two observers said that the jets were in another part of the sky when they saw the UFOs, and our study backed them up, there was still a chance that the two UFOs could have been the two jets. We couldn't prove the UFOs were the jets, but neither could we prove they weren't. The controversial study of the UFO's motions that Major Fournet had presented was discarded. All of the panel agreed that if there had been some permanent record of the motion of the UFOs, a photograph of a UFO's flight path or a photograph of a UFO's track on a radar scope, they could have given the study much more weight. But in every one of the 10 or 20 reports that were offered as proof that the UFOs were intelligently controlled, the motions were only those that the observer had seen. And the human eye and mind are not accurate recorders. How many different stories do you get when a group of people watch two cars collide at an intersection? Each of the 50 of our best sightings that we gave the scientists to study had some kind of a loophole. In many cases the loopholes were extremely small, but scientific evaluation has no room for even the smallest of loopholes, and we had asked for a scientific evaluation. When they had finished commenting on the reports, the scientists pointed out the seriousness of the decision they had been asked to make. They said that they had tried hard to be objective and not to be picayunish, but actually all we had was circumstantial evidence. Good circumstantial evidence, to be sure, but we had nothing concrete, no hardware, no photos showing any detail of a UFO, no measured speeds, altitudes, or sizes, nothing in the way of good, hard, cold, scientific facts. To stake the future course of millions of lives on a decision based upon circumstantial evidence would be one of the gravest mistakes in the history of the world. In their conclusions, they touched upon the possibility that the UFOs might be some type of new or yet undiscovered natural phenomenon. They explained that they hadn't given this too much credence. However, if the UFOs were a new natural phenomenon, the reports of their general appearance should follow a definite pattern. The UFO reports didn't. This ended the section of the panel's report that covered their conclusions. The next section was entitled Recommendations. I fully expected that they would recommend that we at least reduce the activities of Project Blue Book, if not cancel it entirely. I didn't like this one bit because I was firmly convinced that we didn't have the final answer. We needed more and better proof before a final yes or no could be given. The panel didn't recommend that the activities of Blue Book be cut back, and they didn't recommend that it be dropped. They recommended that it be expanded. Too many of the reports had been made by credible observers, the report said, people who should know what they're looking at, people who think things out carefully. Data that was out of the circumstantial evidence class was badly needed, and the panel must have been at least partially convinced that an expanded effort would prove something interesting, because the expansion they recommended would require a considerable sum of money. The investigative force of Project Blue Book should be quadrupled in size, they wrote, and it should be staffed by specially trained experts in the fields of electronics, meteorology, photography, physics, and other fields of science pertinent to UFO investigations. Every effort should be made to set up instruments in locations where UFO sightings are frequent so that data could be measured and recorded during a sighting. In other locations around the country, military and civilian scientists should be alerted and instructed to use every piece of available equipment that could be used to track UFOs. And lastly, they said that the American public should be told every detail of every phase of the UFO investigation, the details of the sightings, the official conclusions, and why the conclusions were made. This would serve a double purpose. It would dispel any of the mystery that security breeds, and it would keep the Air Force on the ball. Sloppy investigations and analyses would never occur. When the panel's conclusions were made known in the government, they met with mixed reactions. Some people were satisfied, but others weren't. Even the opinions of a group of the country's top scientists couldn't overcome the controversy that had dogged the UFO for 5 years. Some of those who didn't like the decision had sat in on the UFO's trial as spectators, and they felt that the jury was definitely prejudiced, afraid to stick their necks out. They could see no reason to continue to assume that the UFOs weren't interplanetary vehicles. End of chapter 16. Recording by Roger Moline.